world civilizations. In this video, I'm going to be covering briefly some of the big effects caused by the voyages of exploration. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how these voyages affected the global economy by opening up new trade routes and also facilitating the exchange of plants and animals around the world. So here are the things that we are going to learn about. We're going to be learning about the silver trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and the Columbian Exchange. By the end of the video, you should be able to explain these three things. Look at your guided notes. This will help you know exactly what you need to explain about each of these. Second, you're going to need to be able to talk about how these three things, the silver trade, Atlantic slave trade, and the Columbian Exchange, affected the following places. How do they affect the Americas? How do they affect Europe? And how do they affect Africa? All right, so that's what we're going to learn about. You should probably just watch the whole thing and then try to fill out your guided notes afterwards, after kind of listening to the whole video. So one quick note before we start. The voyages of the exploration have the effect of causing a more global world. So before the voyages of exploration, before 1492, the world was regional. And what this meant is that people around the world are divided up into different areas. So the people in the Americas only stay in the Americas, and the people in Eurasia are only in Eurasia. They don't interact with each other. They don't even know that they exist. After 1492, the world becomes global. And what that means is that people all around the world are connected. Specifically, they're connected to each other by webs of trade and cultural exchange. So people all around the world exchange goods, and they exchange ideas. This process of becoming more global is called globalization, and it's a process that is still going on today. There are three major systems of exchange caused by the voyages of exploration that we're going to look at today. I've already mentioned these, and we're going to move on and look at them right now. So the first system of exchange we're going to look at is the silver trade. So before exploration, this is what was going on. India and China control most of the world's trade and only want to trade with Europe for either gold or silver. Europe doesn't really have anything else that India or China want. Europe is cut out from trade and can't really even get to India and China, and they don't really have anything to trade with them. Therefore, Europe is poor and is not really very powerful in the world compared to India or China. After exploration, though, this changes. Portugal sets up a trade route with by going around Africa to get to India and China. At the same time, the Spanish conquer South America and discover huge silver reserves there. Absolutely astonishing quantities of silver. So what happens is the Spanish mine this silver and send it back to Europe, which allows for Europeans to make stuff. And this is good for European cities because there's more money flowing around and more people can get jobs. Also, some of this silver can go from Europe around Africa to India and China, and then you can use the silver to trade to get stuff from India and China back to Europe. Silks, spices, porcelain, cotton, all the good stuff that they've got in India and China. And this is what the trade looks like. So take a look at this map. There are three steps to this trade. In step one, the Spanish mine silver from South America, and they send it back to Europe for manufactured goods. So they buy manufactured goods from Europe in exchange for silver. Step two, Europeans take silver from Europe, sail around Africa, and go to India and China, and trade this silver for stuff from India and China. And then in step three, the yellow arrow, the traders return from Asia with products from there. So they trade their silver for tea, silk, spices, and then sail back to Europe. And there they sell that for huge profits. And this allows them to make a bunch of money and start the whole process over again. So now Europe is in the center of a system of global trade. While this is going on, European cities are making a lot of money because of all of this trade, and also because they're now making stuff to send to the Americas. On top of this, European governments are becoming very rich because what they can do is anytime a ship lands with stuff, they tax it, which allows them to take some of the money and use this to expand the power of their government. So you can build armies and roads and factories and whatever other good stuff you need using the money from this trade. So this is a very powerful shift. And this is the main reason that Europe is going to go from being weak in the Middle Ages to being very powerful during the modern period. All right, so let's look at the next system of exchange. This one is going on at the same time. And this one is called the Atlantic slave trade. It happens in the Atlantic Ocean, and the main thing being moved around is, darkly enough, a whole bunch of people. Millions and millions of people. So before exploration, there was not very much connection between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. There was zero connection between America and Europe and Africa. After exploration, this is what happens. European colonists over in the Americas want to make money by farming special products that you can only grow there. This is stuff like sugar and tobacco. They want to grow this stuff and sell it back to Europe. The European colonists, in order to do this, set up plantations in the Americas. And then they try to take the Native Americans who live there and force them to work. But the problem is that the natives die or run away. A lot of them die because of exposure to European diseases. So there's nobody to work on these plantations. And what the European colonists do is they start to bring slaves from Africa to work on the plantations. There's a picture there of a sugarcane plantation in the Caribbean, and the people who worked on this plantation would have been almost entirely slaves brought from Africa. So here's what the slave trade looked like. It's kind of a triangle. In fact, some people call this triangular trade. So it goes from Europe to Africa to the Americas and then back to Europe. So it starts with Europe loading up a ship with guns, rum, and cloth. Those are the three main things they trade to Africa. And the ship will go down to Africa, and they will meet African leaders and exchange guns, rum, and cloth for slaves. These slaves will be loaded up on the ships, and it's one of the most evil things in history. These people are loaded up on ships like cargo. They're chained up, they're stacked in dark, stinky bottoms of ships, and they are sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. Lots of the slaves die on this passage, sometimes called the Middle Passage, and it takes about a month or 2 months to get from Africa to the West Indies. That is the Caribbean islands, and also Brazil, and also the southern parts of the United States. The slaves are sold here in exchange for stuff from the Americas, specifically sugar, tobacco, or silver. The sugar, tobacco, and silver is then loaded up into the ships and taken back to Europe. And these can then be sold in Europe for huge profits, which generates a whole bunch of money, both for the traders and for European governments. And it produces enough money for them to start the whole process over again. They can buy another ship, they can fill it up with more guns and rum and cloth, and go back to Africa and start the whole process over again. All right, and our last system of exchange is called the Columbian Exchange. Now, the first thing to know about the Columbian Exchange is that it is not a trade route. The Columbian Exchange is not a trade route. The other two things we were talking about was trade, where people are continually carrying different things from one part of the world to the other. That is not what the Columbian Exchange is. Instead, the Columbian Exchange is the spread of plants and animals and diseases between the Americas and Eurasia and Africa. Before this, the Americas and Europe were split, and they had totally different biospheres. That is, there was one set of plants and animals living in North America and South America, and there was a totally different set of plants and animals living in Europe and Africa. And as people start to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, they start to move these plants and animals and diseases across the ocean so that they can live on both sides. And so what you get is, instead of two totally different biospheres, you get the mixing until all of these plants and animals and diseases live on both sides. And this can be really good and really bad. So we're going to look first at the spread of diseases. So as you hopefully learned in biology class, diseases are actually living organisms, or at least almost living in the case of viruses. So anyway, what happens is when Europeans show up in the Americas, they bring with them a whole bunch of diseases. And these are diseases that Native Americans have never been exposed to before. These are diseases like smallpox, measles, typhus, the chickenpox, influenza, a whole bunch of them. And because the Native Americans have never been exposed to them before, these diseases are much more deadly to them than they are to the Europeans. And what this does is it wipes out somewhere between half to 90% of all Native Americans living in the Americas. This is brutal. It's one of the worst epidemics in human history, and it is almost apocalyptic for the Native Americans. Many Native American societies are weakened by the diseases even before the Europeans get there. One of the reasons that the Spanish were able to conquer the Aztec and the Inca empires so easily is because their societies were already weakened by these diseases. For example, many of the Inca's rulers had died from mysterious diseases which had resulted in a civil war that had just ended when the Spanish got to the Inca Empire. And that made it much easier for them to conquer. Like I said, made it much easier for the Europeans to conquer. However, the Europeans also did get some diseases from the Native Americans. Specifically, European explorers got syphilis from people in the Americas, and then they brought it back to Europe. So that's a little bit of payback, but it doesn't make up for the terrible death toll caused by all of these European diseases. It is important to keep in mind, though, that Europeans didn't know they were doing this. Nobody really understood how diseases worked back then. Okay, the other impacts of the Columbian Exchange. This is mostly good stuff. Eurasia and Africa get a whole bunch of really amazing plants. The Americas have some really good crops, and these crops will help Europe to expand. So some of the things that Europe gets are potatoes, corn, beans, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, cocoa, and chili peppers. So imagine how much all of these plants would help Europe to feed itself and to produce good food. The most important one is potatoes. Potatoes are amazing. They are really nutritious. You can live basically just on potatoes, and you can produce a whole bunch of them on not very much land. This leads over time to a rapid population growth, because if there's more food, then people can support larger families, and those people will survive to have families of their own. In the Americas, the main thing they get are animals. The Americas did not have useful animals before the Columbian Exchange. So they get pigs, cows, sheep, and horses. Horses are super important because they make it easier to farm, because they can pull plows, and because they can help people to travel and transport stuff by pulling wagons. Pigs are important because they allow for the production of cheap meat, and all animals provide poop, aka fertilizer, which makes it easier to farm. So the Columbian Exchange has some serious long-term effects. Number one, it results in a drop in the American population. Between 50 to 90% of the people living in the Americas die, but over the long term, the population recovers in America as more people move to the Americas, and Europeans and Africans multiply living in the Americas. Eurasia sees a huge population increase because more food equals more babies. And if you look at that chart there, you can see the growth of human population over time. So up until Columbus's voyage, you will see that the human population grew very slowly. But after Columbus's voyage, the human population spikes. And a big part of it has to do with the better crops made available by Columbus. The population boost in Eurasia allows for there to be more people to spread back into the Americas. So even though many Native Americans die, these people are later replaced by Europeans and Africans moving into the Americas. So what are the big results of all of this? Well, together, the Columbian Exchange and the new system of global trade do the following things. One, it results in major population changes. Europe population explodes, growing from 73 million in 1492 to 111 million in 1700. The population of the Americas collapses, going from 41 million to 13 million, but it's going to recover over time. Second, African and Native American societies are harmed terribly. Native American societies are basically destroyed and replaced by Europeans. West African societies are destabilized by the slave trade and also by the increasing warfare that the slave trade causes. And last of all, Europe becomes very powerful. Europe becomes central in world trade because of the silver trade and the slave trade. European cities are able to expand because of this trade. European governments become more powerful. And last of all, you see increasing globalization that continues up to today. So anyway, that's your video. Sorry this took 15 minutes, but you know, what can you do?